All right, folks. Well, there's so much I can say about the United States beginning in 1820. And I'm going to let the textbook speak for me right now. And what I've put in the textbook tonight is a documentary on the Trail of Tears, which is part of the story of Andrew Jackson's time in office. It technically happened after he left office, but Andrew Jackson is the man of the hour this week, and he will be the man of the hour really for the next couple of weeks. He also is kind of a presidential relative in terms of style and substance to the current president. You might have heard that before, that Donald Trump resembles Andrew Jackson more than any other president. So I'll let you judge that for yourself. But just let me give you a little sense. You could see that in 1830, per capita income, I don't still think it matters much, or GNP. Yeah, there was money being made in the nation, especially with the plantation system, but there were a lot of people in the United States at this time who were very busy, who worked very hard, and made almost no money. And not because they were poor, and not because they couldn't get other kind of gigs. These people were farmers. They lived on their own, supported their family with their farms, traded with their neighbors, did bartering, and it was a different kind of economy back then. So don't let these sort of economic figures throw you too much. What you'll start to see in this era is you'll start to see that the nation expands, and that's no big surprise. Eventually, the nation would expand to the current borders, which is all the way from the Pacific to the Atlantic. But by this time in American history, 1820, which is when Andrew Jackson sort of comes onto the scene politically, you can see that there was a lot of territory that wasn't settled. And what that meant is there were a lot of people taking on the Native Americans. There were a lot of people who were getting very cheap land out west. And so you had this large group of either propertyless or what would normally be considered to be squatters living on the land. And by the time Jackson throws his hat in the ring to be elected in 1824, those people could vote. They couldn't vote before then. And I want to show you next week a lot of these kinds of maps because I think there's a very interesting story to tell through images about this period. We begin by looking at the Missouri Crisis, the Missouri Compromise, it came to be called. And this was an incident where Missouri was sort of proposed by constitutional regulations to become a state. It had been a territory, it had a capital, it had a requisite amount of individuals there, and so it met the sort of the requirements of the Constitution. The problem is Missouri wanted to come into the state as a slave, come into the Union as a slave state. And as you can see here, Missouri is above what typically then was considered the Mason-Dixon line, the line that any new territories would come into statehood without slavery. This was just kind of an agreement. And the people in the nation, the white people in the nation who were making all the decisions, really didn't have an enormous opposition morally to the institution of slavery. But there was this sense that the existence of slavery in certain parts of the country gave those parts of the country a different nature and a more significant political power. Because as you remember from a couple weeks ago, if you own slaves, then your political representation would be higher than those members of society who didn't own slaves, because 3/5 of the slave population, even though they couldn't vote, even though they weren't even considered to be human, would be counted towards representation. So for instance, Missouri, if it had slaves, would have maybe 10,000 white um, residents, but they would get representation for 13,000 residents, which means they would have more people in the House of Representatives than a similar sized northern state. So that's where you get these struggles over slavery in the territories. And then the politicians at the time didn't want those struggles to take place. So they made this compromise. Missouri could come into the Union, but it would be the last territorial area that would come into the Union above a certain line, and that line was at the lowest border, the bottom border of Missouri, all the way over theoretically to the Pacific Ocean along the 3630 parallel. That line would mark the area where everything above it would come in as free territory. And part of the reason was this political issue, and another big part of the reason is because by this time, slavery wasn't profitable in the northern regions. People had to pay, $10, $12, $15,000 for a slave in today's money. That only pays off if you have warm climate year-round and you can grow a single crop. That wasn't the case above this Mason-Dixon line. And so Missouri still was very insistent. They would come into the Union as a slave state. And so the leaders of Congress decided that Missouri could come in as a slave state, but also at the same time, this same sized area, approximately, would come in as a free state. So there'd be this balance. From that point on, really, if some territory came in as a state, if slavery was going to be part of that territory, then usually they would have to wait until a free territory was ready to come in. So for instance, Arkansas, where's Arkansas? Here it is, Arkansas Territory. Comes into the Union in 1836, I believe. You all probably know that fact, but I think it's 1836, maybe 1837. But I know that Michigan came in 1837. They were supposed to come in at the same time. Arkansas is a slave territory and Michigan as free territory. But there was this little war that took place right here, the Toledo War, it's called. One guy got stabbed with a penknife. That's the entire casualty list. But nevertheless, there was this idea that Michigan needed to, by the way that the maps had been drawn, Michigan would include Toledo, and Ohio said, no way. So Michigan ended up with the Mitten and the Upper Peninsula. This would become Wisconsin, of course, and Minnesota. So lots of history taking place in this history class. And all of this stuff you might have known already. Nevertheless, this Missouri Compromise becomes important later, whereas you see free by Missouri Compromise. When this territory became valuable to all Americans, including slaveholders, then there was some controversy. But that wouldn't happen really until the 1850s, because this whole territory would become part of the United States after the Mexican-American War in 1848. You writing all this down? So, James Monroe, he's the third of the Virginia Triumvirate. He follows Madison and Jefferson. All of them have 8 years terms. All of them are from Virginia. So you have 8 times 3, 24 years of Virginians sitting in the White House. And Monroe had been, there's a lot more to say about the Monroe era, and you'll learn about that. But it's kind of interesting that Monroe had been the Secretary of State for James Madison. James Madison had been the Secretary of State for Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson had been the Secretary of State for George Washington. So except for John Adams, everybody who'd been Secretary of State in the previous administration would become the president. And in most cases, it was for 8 years. And so In fact, John Quincy Adams, who would become the president after Monroe, also was the Secretary of State. He was Secretary of State on Monroe. So what happened in 1824 is there was kind of a tie. You'll learn more about it. But that tie was broken in Congress. And the person who sort of threw his supporting votes over to John Quincy Adams, who would win the election, would be appointed by Adams as the Secretary of State. So the idea is Henry Clay, even though it didn't seem like he was doing funny business, a lot of people said, this is corrupt. Clay's lining himself up by giving the votes to Adams, whereas, as everybody knows, or if you don't, you better figure it out, Andrew Jackson got far more votes and electoral votes than John Quincy Adams. But John Quincy Adams gets elected in Congress. I think, I don't know, you can look this up, but I think that when there's a disputed election, which means that nobody gets a plurality, is plurality or majority? Nobody gets a majority of the electoral votes cast, then it goes into Congress, and then Congress can do whatever they want. They can elect, they can, propose that their mother-in-law be the president, even if women can't vote. There's no real rule. So what happened here is the person who got fewer votes, ended up becoming president. And so the people who supported Jackson, who was kind of a wild man, he was a general in the War of 1812. He becomes a hero in the nation, but he liked gambling, he liked prostitutes probably. He married a woman who was already married to someone else. He owned race horses, he smoked, drank a lot of coffee. Bad guy. So Jackson becomes president of the United States in 1828. So this chapter is sort of the story about how that happens. But as you can see, a lot of it had to do with this corrupt bargain. In order to understand why everybody thought that Henry Clay was doing something really terrible, you have to understand that the Secretary of State was seen as sort of the stepping stone to the presidency in those days. It wasn't really a corrupt bargain, but Jackson's supporters, along with Jackson himself, were the first in America really to aggressively campaign to be president of the United States. Usually what would happen is somebody would nominate somebody. Madison would be nominated by Jefferson or somebody in Virginia, and they would never campaign. They'd sit at home, and people would speak on their behalf, but usually based on their reputation, people would decide who they wanted to elect. Well, in this case, everything went, and the election got nasty. John Quincy Adams and Andrew Jackson didn't say nice things about each other. And the fact that Jackson had been a bigamist, married somebody who was already technically married to somebody else, became a big issue. In fact, it became such an emotionally charged issue that his wife, who he loved dearly, ended up dropping dead right after the election. And of course, that made him angry. He'd already been in a number of duels. He'd killed some people. He'd been shot in duels. I mean, he'd also killed plenty of people in military service. So an angry Andrew Jackson was not a pretty sight. And it seemed to the founding fathers who were still alive and to Americans who'd seen all these kind of civilized gentlemen as presidents, that this guy from Tennessee, first president, by the way, who wasn't from either Massachusetts or Virginia, this guy from the wilds in Tennessee was setting a whole new precedent for what it's like to run the executive office. So he's the guy we're going to pay attention to. And the reason I like to think about him isn't so much about how he felt about Native Americans or slaves or violence or women. I mean, the guy was most important to me because he was the first president and one of the only presidents, really, maybe until Franklin D. Roosevelt, who took on as his kind of pet cause the working class in America, which doesn't mean people who worked in factories. Many times it meant people who worked on these independent family farms, the yeoman farmers. So the yeoman farmers become the heroes in the story of Andrew Jackson. And that changes everything in American politics. And I think, and I want you to sort of like go along with me as I explain this over the next couple of weeks. I think that explains why the Civil War happens. Far more than anything having to do with slavery. The fact that Andrew Jackson came into office, supported a kind of more traditional, non-capitalist way of living as being the most virtuous way to live. And he was very, very compelling about it to his supporters. That set up the situation in the 1850s, and before that, the 1830s, 40s, and 50s, where it seemed like it was two nations. One that was ambitious, resembled much more the nation that we all know, and one that was sort of lazy, you might say. They worked hard, but they didn't really want to succeed any more than their parents had succeeded. The idea of progress was kind of an ugly thing to them. So think about how strange that would have sort of developed in an entire society. That's the period of time that we are in at this point in history 1100. So enjoy it. It's a really fantastic period of time. And the documentary about the Trail of Tears takes almost an hour to watch. I put in some questions. You won't really easily be able to get them all right unless you watch the entire documentary. That's at least how I designed them. And I also added a little bit of a research project. It's like the other ones where you go into a primary source and basically you're just playing around in that primary source. I'm not having you write a paper. I think there's just 3 or 4 questions I want you to ask and some pretty pictures. So Jackson gets to run again. He's defeated in 1824. He wins in 1828. Some people think of him as the hero. If you were walking down the street in Royal Oak, Michigan in 1822 and somebody said, "Oh, I hear that the hero is in Virginia this week," they'd be talking about Andrew Jackson. They didn't have to say who they were talking about. And then a lot of people, especially once he got elected, saw him as something other than a hero. They saw him as this kind of a slithery, overly sort of grandiose individual. And he thought a lot of himself, and he thought a lot of the presidency. And you can start to see where some of the similarities between this very unusual, out of the ordinary president that we have now. People love him, people hate him, and not a lot of sort of territory in between. That's how Jackson was. And the other thing about Jackson is he dominated the national conversation like no other president had before. I think that's true with Donald Trump as well. So this is sort of an idea that Jacksonian democracy and this kind of romantic idea of working class and farming people taking over the government has some qualifications to it. And it has to do with really severe hostility against Native Americans. And we're going to learn about the Indian Removal Act and the real effect it had on Native Americans when we watch this documentary. The other thing I want you to think about in this documentary, and I'll let you go, but think about what it was about the Cherokees that are represented, that sort of brought to mind the Jacksonian Democrats, and which group or faction of those Cherokee individuals in Georgia remind you more of Jackson's opponents, which came to be known as the Whig Party. So, in my mind, this movie about the Trail of Tears is also, in a very sort of a surprising way, a pretty interesting depiction of the ambitious Whigs, anti-Jacksonians, American system, all this stuff that's connected with the more progressive wing of American politics at the time. Forward-looking, modern, and more familiar, I think, to us. There were people like that in the Cherokee Nation, and we get to know them. In fact, it's very strange. Here's the kind of a clue about which side it was. But the guy who is the main actor for that faction, the faction that seems more like the Whigs, that seems more like the sort of the ambitious, forward-looking, I actually saw him speaking in a Native American dialect last night on the Academy Award presentation. I don't know if anybody is a movie buff, but if you watch that entire Oscar nomination show, there was one guy who was a Native American, and he was an actor, and I was just sort of, it was mind-boggling to see him at the Oscars, because I just think of him as being sort of the hero of this movie about Trail of Tears. And he's also in an earlier documentary that you've seen. Okay, so last slide. I'll leave these slides available for you. There's no graded questions in them. But this fellow, Andrew Jackson, he had a lot of action when he was president. A lot of important things happened. And it was the rise of the Whig Party, which was in opposition to Jacksonian democracy. It was the beginning and the flourishing of the Second American Party system. And what happened in the 1850s was that party system broke down. And the party system that replaced it is pretty much the party system we have now, which is the Democrats versus the Republicans. But at that time, it was kind of the North, which were represented by the new Republican Party, and the South. This is the first time in American history, in 1860, when you had political party systems that were divided not by wealth or by character, but by region. So all this is interesting stuff to me. I hope you find some of it interesting. And if you have any questions, make sure you contact me. All right, let's see how I can close this thing down. And